The year was 1945, and Europe was nothing more than a graveyard wrapped in fog. Winter still crawled through the broken bones of cities, whispering through shattered windows and burned-out rail stations. Roads that once carried families now held only silence, and the stench of ash clung to every stone. Germany was falling, not in flames, but in slow motion, like a building collapsing one brick at a time. Among this slow collapse, not all battles were fought with guns. Some were quieter, less visible, and forgotten by history. One of those stories began with a girl named Elsa Richter. Elsa had never seen herself as a soldier. At 21, she still believed the world could be fixed with effort and politeness. Her blonde hair had once been worn in neat braids, her hands more accustomed to baking bread than typing coded transmissions. In 1943, she joined the Luftschutz, Germany's Civil Air Defense Corps, hoping to be useful without holding a weapon. The recruiter told her she'd be working with radios safely behind the lines, helping relay messages, not making war. For a time, it almost felt true. The early months were easy. She worked in a converted schoolhouse, full of humming equipment and the scent of bad coffee. The other women laughed often, told stories about the fighter pilots they would never meet, and passed around rationed chocolate like treasure. Elsa liked feeling important. She liked believing she was helping something bigger than herself. But nothing in war stays distant forever. By the spring of 1945, Elsa's unit had moved south to a bombed-out village near Wurzburg. The Americans were getting closer. Each night, the horizon glowed orange, and the radios screamed with urgency. Reports came in faster than they could be translated. Orders changed by the hour. No one knew who was in charge anymore. On a rainy April morning, their commanding officer barked out new orders. Destroy everything. Burn the files. Smash the radios. Prepare to evacuate. Elsa stuffed a scarf, a photograph of her father, and a crust of stale bread into a small satchel. The girls around her were trembling. They'd been told surrender would mean humiliation. Some believed it would mean worse. That night, the officers disappeared. No goodbyes. No instructions. Just gone. When dawn broke, the distant rumble of tanks filled the air. Elsa stood at the edge of the village, staring down a road that now belonged to the victors. The Americans arrived in columns trucks, tanks, soldiers with weapons slung casually over their shoulders. Elsa stood frozen, her hands raised high, her satchel dangling from her wrist. Around her, dozens of other women, some clerks, some mechanics, some barely 18 mimicked the same pose. The men shouted in a language she didn't understand. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. One soldier ripped the insignia from her collar. Another rifled through her bag and held up the bread with a curious look before tossing it back. They were herded together like livestock. There was no violence, but there was no compassion either. Only efficiency. They were prisoners now. Their first destination wasn't a camp. It was a field surrounded by barbed wire, near a makeshift American airstrip. Canvas tents flapped in the cold wind. The ground was soaked from snowmelt, the mud so thick it swallowed boots. Elsa and the other women were pointed toward a corner and left there, confused and silent. The guards, barely older than the prisoners themselves, kept their distance. One spoke rough German and told them they would be processed. No one knew what that meant. That first night was worse than anything Elsa had imagined. The cold seeped through her coat and made her bones ache. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She clung to another girl, Brigitte Voss, a dark-haired volunteer who had once worked in an anti-aircraft battery near Stuttgart. Brigitte whispered, "They're not monsters," as she stared at the American guards. Elsa didn't reply. She wasn't sure what she believed anymore. Each hour blurred into the next. Food came sporadically. Thin soup one day, a handful of hard crackers the next. The women traded what they could, bits of bread, scraps of news. Brigitte tried to keep the others calm. She told jokes. She sang under her breath. But on the fourth night, Elsa woke to find her crying silently. Into her sleeve. More prisoners arrived with each passing day. Men, some Wehrmacht, some older officers with hollow eyes, were kept separate, though Elsa sometimes saw them through the wire. The Americans looked overwhelmed. Too many mouths to feed, too many questions unanswered. Geneva Conventions were just words. The war was still ending, and no one had time for mercy. Then came the jeep. It rolled in late one night, headlights cutting through the drizzle. 2 American soldiers stepped out. One was tall, older, with silver hair under his helmet. The other, younger, held a lantern and moved directly toward the cluster of women. He pointed at faces, scanning them as if selecting vegetables from a market. When his eyes landed on Elsa, she felt her stomach drop. He beckoned. Brigitte squeezed her hand, said nothing. Elsa stepped forward on shaking legs, mud clutching her boots. The guard's grip was firm, but not rough, as he led her toward the vehicle. The older soldier said something, his voice calm, not angry. The younger one helped her into the back of the jeep, and without another word, they drove off. She didn't know where they were going. Every part of her wanted to jump, to run, to scream. But her voice was gone. The road was dark, lined with twisted trees and abandoned buildings. After what felt like hours, they stopped at a farmhouse. Lanterns flickered behind cracked windows. A U.S. flag hung crookily on the wall inside. The older soldier turned to her and in careful German said, "You type?" She nodded, barely breathing. He pointed to a desk. A battered typewriter sat waiting. "I'm Lieutenant Clayton," he added. Then softer, "You are safe here." Safe. The word echoed in her mind like a gunshot. Safe meant many things now. It did not mean free. Elsa sat and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers trembled. Her belly growled. The room was warm. A stove hissed in the corner. A mug of coffee sat beside the machine, untouched. Clayton watched her only for a moment, then turned back to his maps. That night, Elsa didn't sleep. She watched the shadows on the wall. Outside, the camp dissolved into rain and smoke. Inside, she had stepped into a new kind of prison. One without wire. One that spoke softly, offered food, and asked only silence in return. The farmhouse smelled of damp wood, oil, and coffee that was never quite fresh. Elsa sat by the typewriter each morning, her back sore from sleeping on a canvas cot tucked into the far corner of the room. Lieutenant Clayton had not lied. There was warmth, food, and quiet. But safe was a word with soft edges and sharp hooks. Each day she typed reports in a language she barely understood, copying from sheets filled with American script, her fingers stumbling over names, places, numbers. No one explained what they meant. No one asked for her opinion. She was useful now, and that was enough. Clayton was a man of careful silences. He spoke little, mostly to his men, sometimes to Elsa in halting German. He didn't smile often, and when he did, it looked like a habit long out of practice. She watched the way he read maps, drew lines with a dull pencil, stared out the cracked window for minutes at a time. He was not cruel. Not kind either. He existed like a piece of old machinery, reliable, but hollow. Sometimes, late at night, Elsa thought she could hear Brigitte's voice outside, rising faintly above the wind, like a memory or a warning. She hadn't seen her friend since that night. Hadn't dared ask. Clayton hadn't said a word about where the jeep had gone before coming for Elsa. She assumed Brigitte had been taken east or sent to another holding camp. But the not knowing ached like a missing limb. One evening, a corporal brought in a small sack of bread and a tin of beans. Elsa thanked him with a nod. He lingered. His name was Harris, a lanky American with an uneven grin and a gaze that moved too slow across her face. He tried his German poorly, asking where she was from, if she liked working here, if she needed anything. She kept her answers short. He didn't seem to notice the discomfort. Or maybe he didn't care. Clayton saw it from the doorway. "Corporal," he said sharply. "She has work." Harris backed off with a raised hand and a smirk. "Just being friendly, sir." Clayton didn't reply. He only stared until the man left. Afterward, Elsa returned to her typing, but her hands shook. That night, Clayton left an apple on her desk. She ate it slowly, chewing each bite as if it might be her last. When she looked up, he was gone. The next few days passed in an uneasy rhythm. Elsa worked during the day, cleaned her corner, helped carry supplies when asked. She spoke rarely. The Americans treated her with wary detachment. Some offered cautious kindness. Others looked right through her. She learned to read their expressions the way she once read radio signals, short bursts of intent, some clear, some dangerous. Outside, the camp had changed. The wire was reinforced. More prisoners had arrived, men this time. Elsa saw them in passing, skinny, bruised, some with bandages, some with blank eyes that never blinked. No one spoke to them. They were moved like boxes, catalogued like equipment. The Americans seemed overwhelmed by the numbers. Supplies ran low. Tempers frayed. One day, a girl from the camp, blonde, maybe 17, was dragged across the yard by 2 guards. She had tried to steal food from a delivery truck. They didn't beat her, but they didn't hide their anger. Clayton stood at the doorway of the farmhouse, watching. He didn't intervene. Later, Elsa saw the same girl curled up by the latrine, her face streaked with mud and shame. Elsa wanted to help. She wanted to offer even a crust of bread. But she knew better. That kind of kindness could cost everything. That night, the rain came back. The farmhouse roof leaked in 2 places. Elsa placed a tin cup beneath the worst drip and listened to it fill, drop by drop, as she tried to sleep. Outside, the camp was a sea of black sludge. Screams echoed through the dark, someone having a nightmare, maybe worse. The guards didn't react. When morning came, Elsa stepped outside to fetch water. The mud pulled at her boots. She passed a soldier vomiting behind a truck, his hands shaking. War didn't end just because a document said so. It lingered in bodies, in habits, in nightmares. Inside the farmhouse, Clayton sat at his desk, rubbing his forehead with one hand. "You're early," he muttered. "No sleep," Elsa replied. He nodded. "Me neither." She almost asked him why, but stopped herself. Questions had consequences. Later that week, another jeep arrived. 2 officers stepped out, laughing loudly. They wore clean uniforms and smelled of cologne, a luxury no one else had. Elsa felt her stomach tighten as they entered the farmhouse. Clayton stiffened. "Who's the girl?" One of them asked in English. Clayton replied too quietly to hear. The officer smirked. "You running a little office or a little harem, Clay?" Elsa froze. Clayton stood slowly. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "She's under my command." The mood turned cold. The officer chuckled, but said no more. They talked logistics, troop movements, supply problems. Elsa kept her head down and typed. When they left, Clayton slammed the door harder than necessary. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. That night, Elsa couldn't eat. She stared at the bread on her desk and felt like it was made of stone. She thought of Brigitte, of the muddy field, of the girl by the latrine. She thought of Harris and the way Clayton had said, "My command." She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Weeks passed. The camp began to empty. Trucks came and went. Some prisoners were moved west. Some disappeared entirely. Elsa remained. No one told her why. She didn't ask Dot, then came the list. Dot had arrived in a courier pouch, names typed, categorized, marked with stamps. Clayton reviewed it for hours. Then he called for Elsa. "You stay here," he said. "Work not done." She nodded. She wanted to ask what that meant. Instead, she returned to her desk and typed. One evening, Harris returned. He didn't enter. He stood by the fence outside the farmhouse and watched her through the window. Clayton saw him. He didn't speak, just stood behind Elsa and waited until the corporal left. That night, he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. "You're safer here," he said. "Then what?" He didn't answer. She sipped the drink, bitter and hot. "Do I have a choice?" He looked at her, and for a second, something cracked behind his eyes. "None of us do." The room went quiet. That night, as Elsa lay in her cot, she thought about those words. None of us do. They echoed with too much truth. In this strange sanctuary, Elsa had food. She had shelter. She had silence. But she had no choices. She was not free. She was kept, watched, protected. Owned. And the worst part was, she had learned to be grateful for it. By July, the world outside the wire was beginning to speak of peace in past tense. Radios hummed with speeches about rebuilding. Newspapers printed headlines in thick, triumphant letters. And foreign dignitaries toasted with champagne. But inside, the small American post Elsa now called her world. Everything still moved with the slowness of war. The mud had dried into dust. The barbed wire no longer crackled with tension, but nothing truly felt over. The war had simply gone quiet like a gun still loaded, resting on a table. Each morning Elsa woke before the sun, washed her face in a dented metal basin, and sat at her desk. Lieutenant Clayton rarely said much anymore. His uniform grew looser by the day, his hair longer, and his eyes more sunken. He spent hours staring at maps he no longer updated, writing reports no one seemed to read. Elsa typed them anyway. It was what she did. It was what kept her warm and fed. She had stopped counting the days. One afternoon, as the air inside the farmhouse grew thick with heat and stale breath, a new soldier arrived. He wore his uniform like it still mattered, pressed, polished boots, clean shave. He introduced himself in broken German as Sergeant Riley. Elsa barely acknowledged him. New men came and went, bringing with them strange energy that always meant trouble. Riley was different, though. He was talkative, eager, but not leering. He asked her name and waited for an answer, like it meant something. When she finally replied, he smiled and offered her a cigarette. She didn't take it. Clayton noticed. He always noticed. That night, he told her without looking up from his desk, "Keep away from that one." Elsa wanted to ask why, but she didn't. She simply nodded and returned to her cot. The guards at the camp grew younger, more restless. Some had never seen battle. They didn't know the smell of fear or the weight of silence. To them, this place was a chore, a backwater post, a punishment detail. They laughed too loudly, threw rocks at rusted helmets, and called the women behind the wire by names that weren't theirs. Elsa could feel the difference in their stares. One evening, while crossing from the farmhouse to the makeshift kitchen shed, she passed 2 of them lingering near the gate. One said something in English, something low, greasy. She didn't need a translation to understand the meaning. She kept walking, faster now. One of them laughed behind her, loud and sharp. Later, when she told Clayton, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "I'll take care of it," he said. She believed him. She didn't ask how. The next morning, one of those guards was gone. "Reassigned," the others said. No one asked questions. That same day, a small group of women from the camp were pulled for transfer. Elsa watched from the farmhouse window as they climbed into the back of a truck. Their faces were hollowed by sun and hunger. One of them looked up and met Elsa's eyes. There was no hatred in her gaze, only exhaustion. It was the look of someone who had learned the weight of mercy and the price of its absence. Clayton entered a moment later, holding a file. "You're not on the list." "I didn't ask to be off it," Elsa said quietly. He set the file down. "You're not ready." "For what?" "To go back to a country that doesn't want you." She didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Later that night, Riley stopped by again. He carried a tin of peaches, an impossible luxury. He held it out to her like an offering. She hesitated, then took it with both hands. She didn't thank him. She didn't owe him that. "Clayton's got you locked up in here like some kind of pet," Riley muttered. "You know that, right?" She froze. He smirked. "Thought so." She turned away without a word and stepped back into the farmhouse. When Clayton returned later, she didn't tell him what Riley had said. She didn't need to. He knew. The next day, Riley was reassigned Dot, and still the reports kept coming. Still, the typewriter clacked. Still, the war refused to let go. By the end of July, the last remnants of the camp were dissolving. The field was nearly empty. The barbed wire had been taken down. Trucks came daily, loading up supplies, furniture, men. Elsa watched the slow dismantling with a strange sense of vertigo. This place had been her entire world for months, and now it vanished piece by piece as if it had never existed. She tried not to think about what came next. One night, as the sun dipped below the hills in a blaze of orange and red, Clayton joined her on the farmhouse steps. He handed her a tin mug of coffee and sat beside her, silent for a long time. "When this is over," he finally said, "what will you do?" She thought for a moment. "Go home," he nodded, "if there's anything left." She sipped the coffee. It was bitter, but real. "What about you?" He didn't answer right away. "Iowa, maybe. I had a dog once." "He probably forgot me." "You miss it." Some days I don't remember what it felt like." They sat in silence, watching the sky darken. "Elsa," he said finally, "you've been good here. Reliable." She felt a chill under her skin. "I want to make sure you land somewhere safe. I can pull some strings. Get you on a transport west." She studied him carefully. "Why now?" His jaw tightened. "Orders are changing. We're being rotated out. This post is done. And you?" "I'll be gone in a week." Elsa nodded slowly. "Then yes, I'd like to leave." Clayton looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You deserve that." The next few days passed in a blur. Papers filed, boxes packed, uniforms folded into crates. Elsa said little. She worked until her hands cramped, then worked more. She didn't know how to say goodbye to something that had defined her captivity. When her name was called on the final list, she didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just nodded and walked toward the truck, waiting at the edge of the field. Clayton met her there. "You'll stop in Trier first," he said. "From there, it's processing, and wherever they send you." She held out her hand. "Thank you." He took it briefly, then let go. "Be careful." She climbed into the truck. Her satchel, the same one she'd carried from Wurzburg, rested on her lap. She looked back only once. Clayton was still standing there, one hand in his pocket, watching her go. She didn't wave. The truck pulled away, raising dust in its wake. As the farmhouse disappeared from view, Elsa felt the tightness in her chest loosen, just slightly. But it wasn't relief. It was something more dangerous: freedom. And freedom, she now understood, had a price. The ride to Trier took nearly 2 days, broken by mechanical failures, endless inspections, and checkpoints where nobody seemed to know who was in charge anymore. The war had ended. Yes, on paper, in speeches, in the photographs of generals, shaking hands, but not on the ground. On the ground, there were just movements. Columns of men, lines of trucks, the slow, grinding machinery of a world trying to remember how to function again. Elsa sat in the back of a military transport, pressed between two women she didn't know, her satchel clutched to her chest. The same satchel she'd packed on the day the radios went silent. The same one that now held nothing but a scarf, a photo, and a small tin spoon. They reached Trier just before nightfall. The town was half standing, half scarred. Bond churches leaned into the sky like broken teeth. Children darted between alleyways, their faces too thin, too serious. American flags hung from windows in buildings that hadn't seen glass in months. The processing center was a hastily converted school chalkboards still lining the walls, now covered in names, dates, red stamps. Elsa and the others were herded into a line, given blankets, questioned by tired officers, and told to wait. That night, she slept on the floor of a former classroom, beside women from across the country. Some spoke in hushed dialects she barely understood. Some didn't speak at all. They lay still, like bodies after an air raid, their hands clutching identification cards, bread rations, paper scraps of official mercy dot the next morning. A young lieutenant with a clipboard called her name, Richter Elsa. She stood. He didn't smile. You've been cleared. Civilian status reinstated. You're free to go. Free. The word didn't land the way she thought it would. She looked around the room, as if waiting for someone to explain what that actually meant. There was no ceremony, no escort, just a stamped paper, a pointed finger toward the train station, and a muttered, "Good luck." She walked through the broken streets of Trier, with the stiffness of someone still unsure if she was being watched. Every alley, every intersection felt like it might snap shut again. She bought a train ticket with a few Reichsmarks stamped by the Allied command. The train, when it came, was missing windows. Some of the cars still had bloodstains. The journey home was slower than any movement she'd known. Not because of the train itself, it crawled through the countryside at a careful pace, but because of what waited at the end. The landscape blurred by, flattened towns, scorched farms, rivers still bloated with debris. Elsa didn't cry. She just stared. She had seen enough endings. When the train finally wheezed into her village, she almost didn't recognize it. The station was just a platform now. Half the buildings on the main road were gone, replaced by piles of stone. Children ran barefoot through puddles. Smoke rose from chimneys built out of salvaged bricks. Her mother's house, what was left of it, stood behind the church. One wall had collapsed. The roof was patched with canvas. But it was standing. Her mother opened the door and dropped the bucket she was carrying. "Elsa?" She nodded. No words came. Her mother grabbed her, weeping, her hands searching Elsa's face, her shoulders, as if to confirm she was real. Inside, little had changed. A kettle on the stove. A photograph of Elsa's father still hung on the wall. A chipped teacup on the shelf. But the silence was different, heavier. They didn't speak much that night. Her mother didn't ask where she had been. Elsa didn't volunteer it. They simply sat, drinking weak tea, staring at the empty space where the radio used to be dot in the weeks that followed. Elsa tried to resume something like life. She helped repair the garden, carried water from the well, mended clothes. But people looked at her differently. Some greeted her with hesitation. Others avoided her entirely. Word had spread, as it always did, that she had worn a uniform, that she had survived, that she had returned. One afternoon, a woman from the next street spat near Elsa's boots. "You made it easy for them, didn't you?" She hissed. Elsa said nothing. There was nothing to say. In the village, shame had many forms. It wore the faces of collaborators, deserters, widows, and survivors. And in post-war Germany, silence was safer than truth. She told people she had worked in communications, that she had been captured during the retreat, that she had been processed and released like everyone else. She did not mention the farmhouse, the typewriter, the man who had decided when she ate, where she slept, and whether or not she was safe. Clayton became a shadow in her memory, not sharp, but constant. His voice, his stillness, the smell of his coat. She dreamed of him sometimes, not in the way girls once dreamed of lovers, but like someone remembering a night they escaped something they didn't fully understand. She had written him a letter once, months after the war, when the Allied administration had finally allowed civilian mail. She'd addressed it to the only return address. She had a code from the corner of one of his reports. But she never sent it. She burned it in the stove after reading it one last time. She wasn't sure if it was gratitude, anger, or confusion that filled the page. Maybe all three. Maybe none of them. Years passed. Elsa married a man named Friedrich, a baker with strong arms and gentle hands. He didn't ask about the war. He had lost a brother in Russia and never spoke of it. They had 2 children. Elsa worked in the local school, teaching younger girls how to type. She was good at it. Her fingers never forgot. The village healed slowly. Streets were rebuilt. Stores reopened. New flags flew on holidays. The past was buried under new buildings, new songs, new names. But some things never left. Sometimes, late at night, Elsa would sit by the window, staring into the dark, listening to the wind. In those moments, she would see the farmhouse again. The dust on the floor, the soft hiss of the stove, the way Clayton had looked at her, not with desire, not with cruelty, but with something heavier. Something like ownership. Something like mercy. She still didn't know which was worse. When her daughter turned 16, she asked Elsa if she'd ever worn a uniform. Elsa paused, then nodded. Yes, she said softly. For a time. Was it scary? She smiled, but her eyes stayed distant. All of it was. And that was all she said. Decades later, when historians came to the village asking questions about the war, Elsa refused to speak with them. She didn't want to be a name in a book, a statistic, a case study. She had survived, yes, but not because of courage. Because of silence. Because she'd learned when to speak and when not to. Because she'd made bargains with herself and with others. At night, she sometimes dreamed of that final moment. The truck idling, her satchel in hand, and Clayton standing in the dust, watching her go. She had wanted to ask him why he had kept her, why he had protected her but never touched her, why he had said, "You're safer here," as if safety was something he owned and could lend out. But she never asked. And he never offered the answer. Now, years later, she understood the truth that had taken a lifetime to surface. The war hadn't ended in a farmhouse or a transport truck or a village road. It had ended in the quiet compromises made by those who wanted to live. And some of those compromises lasted longer than any occupation. Elsa never returned to Trier, never visited the campsites, never reached out to see what became of Lieutenant Clayton. Maybe he went home. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he carried her name like a secret. Maybe he forgot her entirely. But she never forgot him, because he had shown her the most terrifying truth of all. That kindness could be power. That safety could be a cage. That surviving could sometimes feel like surrender. And that the hardest part of war wasn't living through it. It was learning to live after.